Lovely to be here. My talk today is actually going to be a little bit different to what I was asked to do. And that's the whole thing about equalities, and diversity. So I'm going to be diverse. Just looking at the traits earlier. So I'm actually going to be authentic. So I'm actually going to be me, okay? With no apology, I'm going to be me. And I'm also going to be transparent as well with you, because I think if I'm not transparent, then there's actually no point in me being here. The talk that I'm going to give you today, I normally give to groups of BME staff. And so actually, you know, I stand in front of them as a role model. So that's the talk. And actually, I thought, I'm going to share the same story with all of you today. And as you listen, what I'd actually like you to think about is, what are the, I'm going to kind of call them EDI touch points. That might not necessarily be the phrase, but what are the triggers that you hear that say, actually, there's something as an organisation that could have been done differently. There's a policy issue here, maybe there's a legal issue, maybe there's something that as an individual, you could do differently or within my role. Is that making sense? So kind of listen with that there. So I've called this talk From Windrush to Victorious because my journey doesn't start from when I started within the NHS. My journey starts really from before I was born. The pictures there just show the many faces of me about authenticity. One of my challenges often at work was, up until a few years ago, is which bit of me do I take to work? Yeah. Which is the acceptable bit of me that I take to work? Which is the bit of me that actually won't stand out, that will make me just fit in with the organisation? And that was me for a number of years. And more latterly, I was saying, well, actually, I'm a holistic being. So who I am at work is also who I am with my friends, is also who I am, you know, and I say at work when I'm doing consultancy. It's also who I am in my faith community. And my try is to be authentically me. So that's why there are all those different pictures up there. This is my mother and father in their very late teens. They came to England in 1953 from Jamaica. And they came as a result of, they came in the Windrush era. Yes, you're all familiar with Windrush. So they came in the Windrush era. And the Windrush era was as a result of the call. Yeah, so from Jamaica, it was a call from the motherland to come and work within the UK. My mother was a teacher, and my mother was teaching, and my father was working in engineering. So my mother came with the high hopes of coming to England, going into the English education system to qualify as a teacher in England. And my father, similar in terms of his role in engineering, wanting to go to university and become qualified as an engineer. They got to UK, the usual stories about being cold and you know, houses with chimneys, and they thought they were factories. But they got to UK, and those hopes and desires were completely shattered. My mother tried several times and was not back. My father ended up driving a bus. My mother ended up having 5 children because she couldn't get into her teacher training. It kind of ended up well. Ultimately, my mother trained as a teacher, she was a lecturer, and she was senior lecturer at Oxford University. But she went through a number of trials to become a lecturer. My father similarly ended up in engineering, but had to go through a number of trials. One of the stories, and I'll tell this quickly, one of the stories my father told me recently was that they'd book a holiday. So everybody books a holiday somewhere down south wanted to book a holiday. Might have been a caravan, as there were 7 of us. And the booking would be taken, that's great. So we'd all pack up into our estate car, drive down all the way to Devon or Cornwall or whatever it was, get to the site to be told, oh, there no vacancies. It's full. And my father said that was a recurrent theme, which is why we bought a caravan, put it on a site. We used to go down to Burnham-on-Sea every year. But there were obstacles all the way through for my parents in the 50s. Here we see, there is a laser. This gentleman here is the Premier, or the equivalent of the Prime Minister of Jamaica. This individual here is me. So Michael Manley, who was from Jamaica, wanted to come, when he came to England, and he wanted to see a family that had settled well in England. So we were considered to be a family that had settled well, because my parents had managed to complete or start their education, formalised education, because we had a house that was not a shared house. It was our house for the 7 of us. And we were considered to be doing well. And there was lots of press around, and as you can see, these aren't my siblings, just in case you're wondering. These aren't my siblings. They're our next door neighbours. So I was born and raised here in England, went to primary school. My father said to all of us, you have to work twice as hard as anybody else if you want to get anywhere in life. I could see some heads nodding. I thought, nonsense, that's absolute nonsense. Went to primary school, infant school, was happy memories there. Primary school, happy memories. There weren't as many children there from a BME background. It was predominantly white. We lived in a very white middle-class area. All was well until the last year of my primary school. My best friend was called Joanna Shapland, who had long blonde hair. And we went everywhere together, and we did everything together. We sat together in lessons, we worked together. So we had worked together naturally in our maths. Joanna went up to the teacher first. Teacher said, excellent, Mr. Wrench, excellent. I went up to the teacher, bearing in mind Joanna and I had worked together, for him to say, looked at it and said to me, you will never make anything of yourself. You will never be any good at maths, and you just won't be any good at anything. That stuck with me for decades, absolute decades. And as a consequence then, anything to do with numbers, anything to do with maths, I would absolutely cower away from. Until one time when my children said to me, they were in probably early teens, said, Mum, can you help me with my maths? And I said, oh, no, I'm no good at maths. My husband said to me, you need to change the record. You need to tell yourself a different story. Somebody has told you something that you have played over and over and over again, and you have now believed it. As a consequently, I did change the record. I'm okay at maths. Obviously, sitting on a board, I've got to be able to read a budget sheet. I started my nursing in 1978 at a place in Birmingham called Dudley Road Hospital. It's now called City Hospital. When I started my nursing, my father said to me, under no circumstances except, this is so you can work out how old I am. When I started nursing, my father said to me, under no circumstances except state-enrolled nursing. So for those of you who are as old as I am, you'll know that that was a 2-year program. You didn't need as many entry qualifications, and the exam was multiple choice, but actually you wouldn't be able to progress with your career. My father said, do state registered nursing, which is what we've got now. So I was told at my interview, girls like you do state-enrolled nurses. Girls like you do very well at state-enrolled nurses. I think you should apply for that. It's a lot easier, it's only 2 years, and you don't have to take an exam. My father's voice was in my ear, and I pursued and did my state-registered nursing. I went into nursing, and I want to see if you understand this statement. I went into nursing. The days were light, the nights were dark. The days were light and the nights were dark. So I won't say what, so see if somebody gets that later on. But the only way to progress, if you were from a BME background, was to go on to nights. That was the only way that you could progress. If you wanted to become a sister, that was the only way you could progress, was to go on to nights. My desire was to be a health visitor. And at the time, we had to do our midwifery. So I left, I did my midwifery, and then I went into health, and then I went into health visiting. Health visiting, I thoroughly enjoyed. I've always worked in inner city areas, in areas that are considered challenging, in areas that are considered hard to reach. I don't believe in the hard to reach phrase. I think people are seldom heard. I certainly don't consider myself hard to reach, just people just don't know where to look or how to look. And so that was a challenging area, challenging time. When I worked within health visiting at the time, I worked in a very inner city area, lots of child protection, lots of child development problem issues. About 90% of my caseload was Miapuri, so I needed to use an interpreter. Nobody wanted to work there. Nobody wanted to work there. We ended up with a team full of BME individuals because it was not considered the place to work. Everybody wanted to go and work in all of the glamorous areas. But we did some wonderful work. We became a nursing development unit, did a lot of research, and changed the face of nursing nationally. So I had my career kind of mapped out a little bit. Yeah. So as I said, I wanted to be a health visitor. Wasn't too sure where I wanted to do after that, but I knew that I wanted to progress. So the road seemed quite clear, a little bit winding, but I knew I wanted to progress. So for many years, up until possibly 1997, it was fairly smooth going. Fairly calm sea, no problems at all, just kind of got on with life. Whatever I wanted to do, I appeared to be able to do. And then storm happened. The storm happened. My colleague, Sandra Rote, who is white, my colleague and I worked together. I helped to train and develop her, and we worked together. The manager came and offered Sandra a program on the King's Fund, and they offered myself a positive action program. And I couldn't understand this, why I was the person with far more experience who was going out talking about the service, was being offered a positive action program, whereas my colleague was being offered a King's Fund leadership program. So that was one thing. And then our journeys separated. So Sandra's took off and mine took a different direction, which was not an upward direction. She was able to apply for positions. It was very difficult for myself. So I actually took a sideways move. And I moved from health visiting into the HR department, into a training and development role to widen my portfolio as a way of seeing, actually, how can I become a director of nursing? You know, all my colleagues are on that kind of trajectory, yet it seems very difficult. For myself. So there's lots of potholes on the way. So I took that sideways move. I had a very supportive HR director. He left and I ended up reporting directly to the chief executive, which was a really positive thing for me. I was given equality and diversity. And that at the time was classically what happens, and I've heard it with a number of people here. You kind of get given it. So I was given equality and diversity in 97 with not really much idea of what I'm supposed to be doing at all. And every post since, I've been given equality and diversity. Not that it was in the job description when advertised, but you know, I'm given equality and diversity. The potholes on the way were being missed off emails, finding out meetings had happened after the event where actually I should have been there, and I should have been there because of the role that I was in. Yeah. Finding out people had been to lunch and then it'd be like, yeah, so what about me? Yeah. Conversations that ended when you went into the room. One particular organisation, there were about 3 of us at a copier, 3 black women at a photocopier. It was the head of IT, white man, who passed and said, "What are you 3 planning, a riot?" And so the microaggressions, micro-assaults, but at the time for us they weren't micro. For me they weren't micro. Happened. So I moved from a training and development role. I eventually went into assistant director of nursing and community clinical services, and I became a director of nursing within a primary care trust. Yeah. The journey was hazardous and lots of pit holes on the way. So I thought, well, as a director of nursing, there were only about 8 of us nationally, and we all knew each other. As a director of nursing, you kind of think people say, "Oh, well, you've arrived and it's okay for you, you know, you're okay." And there were even people thinking, well, what are you doing for, now you've got to that position, what are you doing for other black staff? What are you doing for everybody else? One of the things I always say that actually it's like a tall poppy syndrome. So when you are other, whatever the other is, okay, you stand out. It's a tall poppy syndrome. So if you cough or sneeze, it's far more noticeable than when everybody else coughs or sneezes. And so life became a little bit intolerable because one of the things about the NHS, constant change, and I love change and work within it and work well within it. And I like innovation and blue sky thinking, but when you're in a team where actually nobody else likes change really, they want to keep their head down, and when you're from an other group, it becomes a little bit unbearable. So there were lots of pit holes on the way. But one of the things that I had to learn was resilience. And resilience means different things to different people. And I know there's I'm sure an Oxford dictionary definition of what it means to be resilient. And so people develop different sorts of resilience that sometimes may make them appear withdrawn, sometimes may make you appear unfriendly, yeah? That sometimes have all different sorts of perceptions. And remember, perception is not the reality. So I withdrew. I became very quiet. I withdrew. So the perception was I was very unfriendly. I was very, standoffish. But I was trying to survive in an environment that for me was quite hostile. And as a director, for me, that was quite hostile. And I was trying to survive. I was trying to work out who are my allies within this organisation? Who are my allies on the board? Who are my allies within the organisation? And it was quite difficult when you kind of realise, actually, you don't have an ally. That actually you need to keep your thoughts to yourself about what it means to be other. Because otherwise what you get is, she would say that. She's off again. And so I left the NHS in 2003. NHS's loss, but I left in 2003 and set up consultancy, and I worked in consultancy around equality and diversity, but also a number of projects around organisational development. Just trying to see what pictures next. And I left, and I was going about my business, doing lots of work with the previous iterations of the Leadership Academy, and I say that because lots of work around positive action programmes, lots of work around leadership and coaching. And then I got a phone call out of the blue from somebody called Sir Graham Meldrum, who is a chair of West Midlands Ambulance Service, to say they were going through their due diligence, wanted somebody on the board with clinical experience. So I applied and was successful. So that's one of them. A few years later, I had another phone call from somebody who said that Health Education England, having reviewed their RES data, recognised that all of, not a certain percentage, 100% of their senior managers were white. And so what they did was put an advert out. They wanted to appoint an associate non-exec with specific responsibility for res. I was reluctant to apply, but I did. I applied and was successful within that position. I used that position and both non-execs' position to look at how do we integrate equalities into the business of the NHS, into the way we do business. I'm not interested in, and we do have the separate agenda item. I want to look at how do we integrate it. I sit in board at Health Education England, which is the strategic body for training, education, workforce. Yeah, and we have a workforce strategy, and I said, so where's the EDI components in this? And the challenge is how do you integrate EDI into the way you do business without actually having to head it up as EDI? What does it look like? What is the impact of what you do on staff? So I sit at the board in West Midlands Ambulance Service, and I'm constantly thinking, we are an ambulance service that is outstanding, CQC outstanding, single oversight framework 1, we've got a really low sickness rate. All of those metrics are great, but actually, what is it like to work in that organisation if you're from one of the other groups? So therefore, what are the experiences, and how does the board get to hear those experiences? When I share experiences that I'm hearing, often the perception is either I've made it up, or you would say that, wouldn't you? And so how do you enable, within your organisations, how do you enable the voices of those seldom heard to come to the board, to come into whichever meeting, without feeling, for me, if I personalise it, without me feeling they're thinking, she would say that, wouldn't she? And so those are real challenges. Going back to my career got to that point of, I've kind of talked about this really, should I stay in the NHS or should I jump? There's a cost to jumping. So when we look at workforce, that's one of the major challenges within the NHS. There is a cost for individuals who jump, and for individuals like me, the cost was my pension. Yeah, so it's very, very real. The cost was my pension. But also, actually, the cost was my emotional and mental health, because I realised for 18 months I couldn't drive anywhere near the trust headquarters for 18 months because it brought back some of the feelings and experiences that I'd had. This slide I put up particularly for, as I said, I do this talk as a role model for BME staff, and it says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. And I think that aptly applies as well in terms of EDI agenda. So if you want to go fast, stay in your offices, write the policies, write these action plans that go to committees, but actually don't talk about the outcomes and the impact. But actually, if you want to go far, then it's really important that you engage, that you look at, well, what are the outcomes for and what's the impact? And so for me, that's really, really important. We can have wonderful strategies. And as a non-executive director, and I sit on a board, and I see the strategy, I say, that's great, but how are we going to measure it? How are we going to know, actually, if it's had the impact that it should have had? How do you know? Maya Angelou is one of my heroines who says, and we may encounter many defeats, but we must not be defeated. And so I often do this talk as a role model. But even in terms of, if you think about it in EDI, sometimes sometimes it's tiring. Sometimes you feel you're knocking your head against a brick wall. Sometimes you're thinking, will things ever change? But the thing is keep going. keep going, because it takes people with passion and people with real enthusiasm to actually make the change and make the difference. And of course, Martin Luther King says, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. I'm going to stop there for questions.
First time, more than say the last few months, I've experienced them being demoralised, lost faith, going to leave, and that's a different side of the person that I really look up to and aspire to. Known each other a long time, but worked in different places, and that was quite worrying for me because when we raise it in our organisation, it's like who's listening, who's acknowledging, who's taking on board it. You know, when we do have really good role models that we can aspire to be like, and how valuable they are, and how we can mirror image their practices and that, when it's not being listened to, it does have a knock-on, a domino effect. But I'm quite, I won't give up. And I've even tried to get this person and look at all the reasons to get them to stay, because I actually still think in my heart of hearts, although it's not my decision that for them to go, they've made that decision, but I actually think they'll be unhappy if they go, because they're going to be left with no closure. And I don't know, for me, I don't know how to stop, I don't know where to start, because I want to keep trying to get this person to stay, because it's not just me that looks up to them, there's lots of people that look up to the person, and I need help with that. I don't know where to go with that. I don't know where I have to draw the line, because I can't draw the line, because I'm not someone that gives up on anything.
Possibly very little you can do, to be honest. It's that tall poppy syndrome. It's so how do we support people who are obviously quite visible, and particularly in senior roles. In senior roles can be quite difficult and quite lonely.
I'm surprised, because when you look at the workforce race equality standards, that person comes under that bracket as well, and how they don't take it, well, they've not taken it seriously. They've done immense work, amazing work, that, and I just can't believe that a person can be treated that way. But I think the biggest shock was seeing how demoralised that person had become and lost faith, and that was a big shock, a culture shock for me, and many others in the organisation that we work with. It's their loss, like you've got to thinking about what you said when you left. Do you jump and the cost of your pension and other things? But what's more, I suppose it's got me thinking, what's more important? Your health, your well-being, or being stuck in a place where you're constantly fighting and battling. So it has given me just hearing you talk has given me something to think about, and still be able to look up to my role model. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got some mics coming round, so who'd like to ask the next question? There we go, mic behind you, Sue.
What do you think would have helped you if you could talk back to your younger self?
It would have helped me to understand. What would have helped me is to understand why I got the adverse behaviour, why I got the adverse comments, why people would call me names, why people looked at me quite differently. That would have really have helped, actually, because growing up in in a very white middle class area where there were there's hardly anybody who looked like me, was actually quite difficult. It was fine up to a certain age, and I don't know if anybody knows of the work of William Cross, but it got to a point where William Cross looks at racial identity, and it gets to a point, and a question it gets to a point where all of a sudden, actually, and the example that I gave about my maths was called an encounter stage. I had a real encounter around what it means to be black in, and I use black in the political term, what it means to be black in a white society. I suddenly thought, actually, I am different. Yes? I am different. And the racial identity model, there's a pre-encounter stage where actually you don't realise you're different. You don't realise you're different, you know, if it's because it's around race. Race isn't an issue, but then something happens and you have an encounter, and that's when you know that you're different. Yeah? And so I'm working with NHS England. I deliver the Workforce Race Equality Standards Res Expert programme. And so we talked about this racial identity with, it's a mixed group like this. And so we said to everybody, when is it you realised you were African Caribbean, African, Asian, white? And what was really interesting for the white participants was some of them said, I've never had to think about it.
Exactly. I think that's where my ignorance is, and I'm saying, please include me so that I can understand and educate other people like me who don't know what they don't know. Until those moments happen, and then you go, oh, word, how did I walk into that when I didn't know I was bringing that with me? And it's a shock. But I don't know the way out of it unless, I think that's 2 or 3 times this morning we've heard it's like we need to put this together. How can we all be part of that and take responsibility? And my arrogance, it's not arrogance, it's ignorance. It's, I just didn't know. And how can we address that? Where we can be educated so that we can walk alongside of people and then know where those potholes open them up. So that we can work with each other to navigate that, and there becomes a greater understanding. And I think that would, I would hope, would make it easier for other people who are coming along behind you, behind us.
Another question here at the front, Johnny.
Yes.
Got a mic there.
Oh, right. That was nice. This is a bit of a strange one. Did you always realise you were being discriminated against? Because I know in my case, I spent about 15 years in the NHS where I was definitely being discriminated against, but I never realised it until it was actually pointed out. Well, no, until I talked about it, that I realised that it was actually not acceptable behaviour. Now, I can understand that because of racism, you'll have faced it a lot more, if you know what I mean. But I was quite naive for a very, very long time, just thinking this is how people were and it was understandable. And I wondered if you've faced the same experiences.
Yes, yeah, you do. I think nobody wants to feel that they're being discriminated against. It's kind of, you know, you don't want to think that way. And so for years, I hadn't thought I had. So if I go back to my nursing career, so I started in 78. I wanted to be a midwife. I applied, I got in. First place I applied. I worked there. I wanted to be a health visitor. First place I applied, I got in. I wanted to change health visiting. I managed to do that, work with the universities. So I've kind of drifted along really nicely from 1978 to 1997. And that's when things started to happen that I started to think, this doesn't feel right. So it got to that point.
Yeah,
Does that
I
help?
can understand that quite
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
I think it's just the feeling of how you have shared your story. The fact that I think it also brought some things personally to just think some experiences. But really what was interesting for me was despite of all those potholes on the way, you still kept going to be where you are now. So my question is, how did you do that? Because I know that if it's NHS, you can't, if you go above band 7, you have done very well. I know that, and I think everybody knows that. But how did you do to keep going? What kept you keep going to be where you are now?
Sorry, before you answer that, could somebody tell us what, somebody like me, what's band 7 even mean?
It's a ward manager or a
Middle manager. hospital manager. I was very focused and very determined. So I told the story of my parents to kind of say they were very focused and very determined. And so my upbringing enabled me to be very focused and very determined. And that actually, when there was a hurdle or a door closed, if the door was closed, there has to be another door. So if it's ajar, push it open, there has to be another door. And so that's why I put the slide about resilience. There were times that I was not resilient, that I would resort to, I would go home and have to stop the car because I was crying so much. Yeah, I would be going into a meeting really, really nervous, not about my capability, but actually about how I was going to be accepted. Were people actually going to listen to me or not? So for me, my resilience and how I kept going was, yes, there was some personal stuff, but for me, networking was really, really important. And finding people who had, not necessarily who looked like me, so that was important, yes, that there were people that looked like me, but that people who had empathy, who actually I felt that I could talk to and share my story and would not be judged. And so it was finding those people that was really, really helpful. But for me, part of it was keeping very focused. I also felt, remember, my father told me that you have to be twice as good. So I constantly read all these NHS documents and policies and constantly really got to try and understand where does health visiting sit in the context of the wider NHS. I was always doing that so that I was preparing myself for, which is why I kind of couldn't understand why I didn't get the same opportunities as everybody else. But that's why, and that's also why I say resilience means different things to different people. You have to find ways of and it sounds really dramatic, find ways of surviving sometimes throughout it.
Got two questions on the front table there.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask if you think things have changed, because you've covered a very long period, and do you think things have changed nowadays?
There are times, and remember, as I'm going to be open and honest with you, there are times that I do and there are times that I don't. So one of the boards, I sit on 3 boards, one of the boards I sit on last year, one of the non-execs, we had a beautiful summer, said to me, "Is it hot enough for you?" That was 1 week. Another week, he came up to me and said, "When last did you go home?" I said, "I go home every night, Tony." Yeah. So and then another time I did a staff a BME staff engagement event in an organisation. I won't say where. And you're going to have to excuse the language, but I need to say it because I need you to I'm answering your question. And this was 17, sorry. Staff were hearing words like Paki. These are from their colleagues, not patients. Paki, nigger, Uncle Tom, DPS. I had to say, what's DPS? Dying Paki syndrome. All sorts of things. And I'm saying it because I was horrified. I went home to my husband and was telling him about the day, and I burst out crying because I thought, I faced this in the 60s. 2017, we're still there. And what's happened is it was overt in the 60s, it's become covert. When I did that staff conversation, there were a number of staff there from EU who said, since Brexit, it seems like people have got license to be really racist. Yeah? And so I really sincerely hope, and I think things are getting better in small amounts, but also it's the covert behaviour that we have to look out for. What is happening out on the wards, out in where, whatever your environments are, out in different areas of the organisation geographically. What is it like to be other out in some far-flung ward or region or whatever else? What are the experiences? This is why, for me, I'm really passionate about how do you engage in a meaningful way with staff, and how do we get those issues back up to the board in terms of the governance processes to make a difference? How are you engaging with the staff in terms of what needs to happen and to be done differently? You know, the worst thing is when you've got a board of, you know, heterosexual males or whatever else, predominantly male, making decisions about EDI. It kind of doesn't work.
Just listening to your journey, you know, your transitions of gone on from one thing to another. I'm curious about your working relationships, because where you've had working relationships where you've trained someone up and then they get they get some sort of training and you get the sort of lesser training, has that impacted on your working relationship with others now? Has that followed you? Do you feel, has that impacted on you in any way?
That example was 1997. We're
Yeah.
still best of friends
Yeah.
now.
Oh, you
So
are? Yeah.
we have to personally rise above it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
It's been difficult, but...
Question up here.
It's not so much a question, it's more of a thought. I've got an 11-year-old son, and hearing about your experiences and know that it's still alive in 2017, my son just takes everyone at face value, and it's that, does more need to be done with education? At what point does some sort of prejudice or discrimination creep in that suddenly you think it's okay to say whatever, or to treat someone more unfairly in the workplace or whatever? I say it's not a question, it's just a thought, and you're thinking, you know, how do we get to that point that was so covert in the 60s, saying now it's still there and widespread but hidden away to a degree? What's happening at some point? And sorry, it's a bit of a ramblings really, but just as you're talking, you know.
It's a really, really good question, because there's if there was a simple answer, we hopefully wouldn't be here. You know, I talked earlier about it being systemic. You know, and you look at, you look in the police and what's happening with the police. You look in education, what's happening in education, in the criminal justice system. It seems to be the systems are set up almost to discriminate. And if you go back to Macpherson, and Macpherson talked about institutional racism, and where he's talking about the systems and practices and policies within organisations unwittingly. And I kind of almost, sometimes I feel very cynical and say, it's not unwittingly, because who writes this? It's people that write those systems. It's people that put those systems and policies and practices into place. And so it's really important that as individuals we look at self and our responses, and actually how we bring young people up. Because I'm sure children aren't born racist or homophobic or whatever else. So it's what is the environment within, and what can we do? Because we can't shield, you can't wrap them in plastic. But actually, if you really start to develop, and this is why values are really important. If you go back to the NHS Constitution and the values that are in there, if we really harness those values, there are a couple of organisations in London who are doing some really good work around. They've done some work around developing their values, which is where most organisations stop. We've got this beautiful set of values. And I always say, yeah, but what does that mean? So what they've now done is taken it further and doing some work around, so what are the behaviours that we expect in relation to those values? What do excellent behaviours look like? Good behaviours and unacceptable behaviours. And they're putting that into their performance management framework. So people start to understand. Otherwise, I think it's a phrase that we love to use, and we do it, and we talked at the table at the back about values-based recruitment, and it becomes a tick box. So we've really got to understand what are the values in your organisation? What do they look like? How do they drive decision-making? How do they drive your business planning, your performance management framework? How do they drive the business of the organisation?
So just a comment is, I love this proverb they mentioned, the African one, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others. I feel that within the organization, at least where I work, the problem is that the management, the senior management, they want to go alone. They do not listen to people because they are not much there. Exec team come, they just want to be, they are going to be there. They know that they are not going to stay long. They want to impress others. The senior manager want to impress the exec team because they know that they are not going to stay in that post. So they don't think strategically about far. They just think about now I'm going to do this and I'm going to go. And they don't listen to people. That is why that NHS, I think, at least I'm talking about some organizations are failing. The CQC failing, the well-led is very clearly showing that it's failure. So that is all. I just wanted to just make a comment. Thank you.
The work, just to add to that, the work that the RES team have done in terms of looking at, and the research that they've done in terms of looking at what works, because unconscious bias training alone does not work. There is no evidence to say it works and it's throwing good money after bad. But actually what they're saying that does work is, you know, it has to be about culture change, shift in culture change, which means leadership. That's about leadership, accountability, we have data, we have to be monitoring that data, and engagement. So all of those things have to be in place at the same time. And leadership isn't, I mean, it's crucial that the leadership comes from the top of the organisation, and the same that you need in terms of culture shift, change, but it has to permeate all the way through the organisation. And lots of people saying lots of things where the block often is middle managers. And so it's really about kind of leadership and how do you get the whole organisation involved.
I'm afraid I'm going to share my age as well, and I do remember very, very vividly when days are white and nights were dark. And I suppose my question is, it's about that was the status, that was the way it was. It was accepted that that's what it was, and obviously now it isn't quite so much like that. But it's about this idea of, and obviously for myself now moving into a practice development role, it's about, and it comes back to Sam's point about this ceiling point of the middle manager band 7 level. So how can we empower, because you have to be really courageous to do what you've done, really courageous to put yourself out there and put all the time. So how could, and the only way we're going to change things is by having that. So how can we empower and encourage more people to be able to what am I trying to say, you know, have the courage to do that, because that's going, that you have to be very brave.
You do, but I'd almost like to turn that round and say, as an organisation, what is it that you need to do to remove the barriers? Yeah, I'd like to turn that round. When I became a director of nursing in Solihull, which is you know, if you want to live long, go to Solihull. Yeah, if you want to live a lot longer than anybody else. And my black peers said to me, oh, people say, oh, you've gone to Solihull, but they don't have black people there. How come you've gone there? You know? And I was courageous, as I say, because of my parents. But it goes back to the whole thing about role modelling. Sometimes if people don't see anybody like them in positions, or they hear stories that say somebody has tried 2 or 3 times and has been knocked back, people get kind of they get frustrated, they kind of just sit back and just say, what's the point? What's the point of hitting your head against a concrete ceiling time and time and time and time again? And that's why people exit the organisation, because actually they see that there's no way that they're going to improve. So there's no point, you know, I sit in one organisation, and I'll be honest, Health Education England, and all of their senior leadership team are white, but they have no strategy for moving anybody up. NHS is often dead man's shoes. There's no strategy for moving for developing the BME talent pipeline. Some organisations also as well think about things like development opportunities. Who are they offered to? How are they advertised? How are they promoted? You know, one organisation that I work with, actually most of I'm really challenging them, because their recruitment they're always doing internal recruitment. So you're not going to get diversity.
just about Brexit. I just really fear, and I'm sorry for bringing up no, I'm not actually sorry for
No,
bringing
don't
up the
don't
It's
apologise.
really important actually, because I think the type of discrimination you faced and others faced, whether they look like you or they sound like me,
Yeah.
is going to intensify
Yes.
over the next few months. And what can we all do together to try and put some... It isn't about hate crime. I'm reporting hate crime. It's about saying it's the small things that you face in your everyday life or people will face. You know, I guess it's more of a statement than a question, really.
I know, and there's no kind of answer, but until organisations really understand what it's like, you know, to walk a mile in your shoes, as somebody from an EU country, some BME, whatever, until you understand what it's like to walk a mile in their shoes and understand what some of the issues and challenges are, then not an awful lot will be done. I think it's really important.
I just feel when I hear people saying on radio and we're getting our country back, and you're thinking,
my experience at one of the boards, and it has to be Chatham House rules, was so Brexit came up and said, okay, yep, great, well, we sorted out our drugs and we're okay with our drugs and blah blah blah. So I said, what about the workforce? The response was, well, our workforce plan is good, so we'll be able to replace those individuals, whatever. I was horrified. It was about replacing, post-Brexit, about replacing those individuals. There's nothing about how do we support and enable people to stay. What about people who've got relatives or perhaps having to... There was absolutely no discussion around that until I mentioned it, and it was like, oh, the light bulb dropped.
Last question.
Just going back to the leadership development for the BMEs, I've actually been going on these courses and I've been finding them really inspiring, but I've been finding when I am going on these courses, the people in the room feel like they're being put in a box. Why is it just for us? And I'm like, I agree, I'm honoured to have the developing and to learn and everything, but then they do, like, the things that are coming up is quite hostile, and you are hearing exactly what you're saying, which is going across all the trusts. But how can we get it to them to show that we are making a difference and to stop the hostility of it, so that they're actually feeling that they are being valued rather than being put in a box? Because even
Who's the they?
When I went on the BME, course,
staff.
we went on a self-discovery course just on Tuesday, and everyone was saying the same thing, like we're not represented across the trust, especially at the higher pay bands. But they felt like it was bad that the course was just offered to them, because then we're feeling like we're being segregated. But it is a good opportunity, so it's how can we promote it in a more positive way?
I think positive action has had a bad light because a number of people see it as positive discrimination as opposed to positive action. So there's something about that. But there's also something about, you know, I'm kind of a little bit like this. I've been through positive action programs and I have taught and facilitated positive action programs. So I am pro them. But I also want to see Nye Bevan, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. I want to see a good representation on those programs as well. So I don't want to have, for BME staff to only be able to access the Ready Now program, but actually how is Leadership Academy doing in relation to its representation and other leadership programs? And that's the thing, we have to get all programs, all leadership programs represented. But there is something about when you are in a positive action program, there is something about not having to explain all the time. There's something about being able to learn to be authentically you, so that when you go back out into the environment, you can become authentically you and influence in a much greater way.
Can I just say about the positive action, it's open to all protected characteristics, values to people now, not just BME members. So that doesn't apply 100%, if you know what I mean, because I could go on a positive action course because I'm a protected characteristic. So you're not just by yourself.
Like I just took on the other day and I was just taking the views of everyone in the room.
Yeah, but they opened it up, I think, last year to women, people suffering from gender dysphoria, in fact everything, disabled people. I'm right, aren't I? Because Patrick
And sorry, just very quickly in response to that, often you see BME staff who go on a positive action are made to feel other. Because people saying, why are you so special? And that's the issue.